Your story changed you. Now let it change the lives of others. This is a Candy Factory Mini. So you want to write a book? With Suzette Mullen.
Join me as we follow the development of a nonfiction book from idea to completion. We'll explore the creative process as well as the nuts and bolts of pitching and publication. Get a behind-the-scenes look of my book coaching process, as well as clear takeaways and nuggets of wisdom. Let me walk alongside you as you learn to tell your story. Hello, I'm Suzette Mullen, book coach, nonfiction writer, and your host. Welcome to this episode of So You Want to Write a Book. My goal is to break down the challenging process of finding and getting clear on your story so you can finally take action on the book that's been rattling around your head or tugging at your heart. And even if you never plan to write a book, I'll share tips that will help you become a more informed reader and/or a more effective writer in your work life. If you have questions, I welcome them. Just go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll be sure to answer them afterwards. So for now, grab a pen and paper or your phone and laptop to jot down some notes and let's get started. Last time we talked about how to structure your how-to or self-help book. And this week we're talking memoir, specifically how to structure your memoir. Now, memoir is a hugely popular genre right now, and it's often the first book that writers tackle. It's natural to want to start with your story, but it can also be overwhelming. It's your whole life after all. Where should your memoir start? Where should it end? What goes in? What doesn't go in? What do you need to leave out? So first, I want us to get clear on what memoir is and what it isn't. Memoir is not your whole life story. That's what we call autobiography, and practically no one writes those anymore. Memoir is a slice from your life. It's a story about a particular theme or idea or struggle or question you've wrestled with. It's not about all the themes, all the ideas, all the struggles, and all the questions you've wrestled with. Now, second, before we get to the nuts and bolts of structure, you need to get clarity on the precise story you want to tell. Now, that's exactly the kind of work I do in my Find Your Story coaching package, which I'm going to give you a sneak peek into in our next episode. So until you know the story you want to tell, there's really no point in talking about structure. So to get clear on your story, I want you to think of your memoir as a journey. You started in one place, and then something happens, and you deal with that. And then you end up in another place. So it's as simple and as complicated as that. These are the 5 things you need to get clear on to get clear on your story. The first, who were you before that something happened? You need to be clear on who that person was. Describe that person both externally and internally. Number 2, that something that happened, it could be an external event like an earthquake or a parent dying, or it could be an internal revelation. The something that happens is almost always something bad or at least disorienting. A colleague of mine, Allison K. Williams, calls this something that happens the suck, which I love this. Number 3, how you deal with that suck. This is the meat of your book. The 4th thing you need to get clear on is how you were changed. Who is the after you, both externally and internally? Now, in memoir, the internal journey is typically what matters most. And the 5th thing you need to get clear on about your story is, what's the takeaway for the reader? What will the reader learn from your story? It's not enough to just tell them what happened. There has to be some kind of a takeaway. So I want us to work through this 5-step process with 2 examples. The first is Wild, which is the blockbuster bestseller by Cheryl Strayed. And the second is Graveyard of Safe Choices, my memoir, which will hopefully someday be a bestseller. So number 1, Wild by Cheryl Strayed. This is the story of Strayed's solo 1,100-mile hike on the Pacific Crest Trail, which took her 94 days. So number 1, who was the Cheryl before? She was in her early 20s in college. She had a mother who she adored. Number 2, the thing that happened, the suck. Her mother got cancer and died suddenly. Her mother's death unmoored Strayed, and she began to lose herself. Number 3, how did she deal with the suck? Well, at first, she didn't deal very well. Strayed had a short-lived marriage. She abused drugs. She was sexually promiscuous. And then in desperation, she makes the impulsive decision to hike the Pacific Crest Trail by herself, to find herself again. So number 4, remember the after. Who is Cheryl Strayed after she deals with the suck? As she hikes the trail, she finds herself again, step by step, mile by mile. And number 5, the takeaway for the reader. Well, at least one takeaway is the road is made by walking. We heal step by step. So I want to try this again, and this time with my memoir, which is Graveyard of Safe Choices. So who was the before Suzette? She was a 50-something empty nester who felt lost in her life. Does that sound familiar? You're going to see a lot of lost and found themes in memoir. So she felt like she wasn't really living her life, and time was running out to do something differently. So number 2, that something that happened, aka the suck. So Suzette writes about a long-term friendship, and her words on the page are disorienting. They make her look at that relationship differently. And she realizes that she was in love with this friend and still is. She begins to wonder, is she gay? What does this mean for her marriage and for her life? So the third part, remember, how do you deal with what happened? How do you deal with the suck? Well, at first Suzette tries to deny it. She tries to put that genie back in the bottle, and because she doesn't want to shake up her life that much. But eventually she grapples with who she is, and then what will she do about that? She ends her marriage, she moves to a new city, and she begins to embrace her very different life. So number 4, remember the after person. So who is Suzette afterwards? She's someone who's living authentically. She's someone who's living her life, not the life she felt she was supposed to live. And finally, number 5, that takeaway for the reader, because there has to be one. And the takeaway for my reader is that you can trust your inner voice to lead you to your authentic self. So once you have clarity on these 5 things, again, let me remind you the before you, the what happened, aka the suck, the how you dealt with what happened, the after you, and the takeaway for the reader. Then you can start thinking about the nuts and bolts of your structure, how you're going to actually tell this story that you have clarity on. Now, there are many, many different ways you can structure a memoir, which is part of what flummoxes writers. So the first one is that straightforward chronology. Another idea is you can use vignettes. Another idea is you can start toward the end of the story and then circle back to the beginning. A fourth idea is you can start in the middle, go back to the beginning, and then straight to the end. A fifth idea is you can start with the suck and then show how you got there and then what happens after the suck. And then a final idea is you can weave back and forth between timelines. And there's probably a dozen other ideas. Now, straightforward chronology is the simplest structure. And it's the one I recommend for most first-time memoirists. You can start your book with a moment showing the before you, before the suck happens. And then the suck happens, the something that happens. Then you're going to show how you dealt with it. That's the meat of the book. And then we see who you are afterwards, how you've been transformed. That's the structure that's largely used in Wild, and it's the one that I've chosen for my memoir. Although, like in Wild, I start with a brief prologue, and then chapter 1 opens with the before me. Note, even with a straightforward chronology, you still have to make decisions about how and when you present everything that happened in the past. So, for example, my book opens in 2012 when I'm 51. Now, the reader is going to need to know a lot about my life before I turn 51 to make sense of my story. So everything that happened to me that's relevant to the story that happened before I was 51 needs to be told in flashbacks or in short memories. And those flashbacks and short memories need to be strategically sprinkled throughout the manuscript. So that's a lot of information. So you may be wondering, how do you decide on the structure for your memoir? Well, I have 2 steps I'd like you to take. First, get clear on those 5 things that I've talked about. The before you, the what happened, how you dealt with it, the after you, and the takeaway for the reader. Do that first. That's critical. And second, or you can be doing this at the same time, go ahead and read memoir. I can't emphasize this enough. If you're going to write memoir, you need to read it. You need to become very familiar with the genre. And what I recommend is you read at least twice, the memoir twice. First read for just the story like you ordinarily would, and then read a second time to study the structure. If you're looking for some great memoirs to dig into, here are a few I'd recommend. Of course, I'm going to recommend Wild by Cheryl Strayed. That's a must. Educated by Tara Westover is another. The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. Making Toast by Roger Rosenblatt, a lovely memoir told in vignettes. And Hourglass by Dana Shapiro. Now, if you're ready to even go deeper, you can go ahead and read some craft books on writing memoir. Here are 3 of my favorites. There's Beth Kephardt's Handling the Truth. There's The Memoir Project by Marianne Roach Smith. And The Situation and the Story by Vivian Gornick. And if you're ready to go even deeper, I suggest you sign up for an online course on memoir, or you can work with a book coach. I work with memoir writers, and I'd love to help you find and share your story. Now, the truth is, writing memoir is challenging. In the first memoir workshop I took, which was with bestselling author Mary Karr, she told us that it took her 7 years to complete Lit, which was her memoir about getting sober and coming to faith. She also told us that she broke the delete key on her laptop while she was writing the book. So in memoir, you have to dig. You have to dig deep. You have to dig beneath the what happened to get at the real story. And that takes time. It takes patience and perspective. It's taken me over 5 years to get clear on my story and then to write it. So I'm really not trying to scare you off from writing memoir. I'm just trying to give you a reality check. I love the genre. I love reading memoir, writing memoir, and coaching memoir. And in my opinion, it's worth the time and energy and effort to write. Because writing memoir can change lives. It can change your readers' lives, and it can definitely change your own life. So are you ready to find your story? I invite you to go to yourstoryfinder.com and sign up for my bi-weekly newsletter. It's chock full of tips to help writers get started, get unstuck, and get their stories out into the world. Now, next time, you're in for a real treat. I'm going to be talking to a special guest. writer, storyteller, and motivational speaker, Jennifer Diaz. And we're going to be talking about how she found her story. So I look forward to seeing you then. And in the meantime, happy reading and writing. So You Want to Write a Book is part of the Candy Factory mini-series and is a proud member of the Candy Factory Collective. You can find the show streaming on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and LinkedIn. And you can subscribe to the audio version anywhere you get your podcasts.
Over the past 8 years, Suzette has been on a mission to help writers clear the fog and cut through the overwhelm so they can move their ideas out of their head and onto the page.
Her later in life coming out journey and her professional experience as an author, accelerator, certified book coach, and Dare to Lead trained professional, as well as her time at Harvard Law School, Wellesley College, and Columbia Theological Seminary, have given her a unique perspective, as well as many of her own stories to tell.
When she's not writing or coaching other writers, Suzette can be found on her yoga mat,
advocating for the Lancaster LGBTQ+ coalition,
or hanging out with her partner, Wendy, and their rescue pup, Lucy.
Visit yourstoryfinder.com to learn more about Suzette and her life story, as well as her writing coach offerings.
Life's too short to stay stuck, so why not write that book?
So You Want to Write a Book is produced by the Candy Factory Collective at the Candy Factory Co-working Campus in Lancaster, PA.
Production support by Anna Tran. Administrative support by Ann Kirby, Ariana Henderson, Krisha Marcel, Jason Mundock, and Robert Diggs. Notes and links can be found on the show post at our website, candyfactorycollective.com. Candy Factory.
Collective.